the boards of all the banks? Anybody who was there at that time?
I think anybody who was there at that time, certainly in 2008 onwards, before 2008, should be gone. But I think there's also a case for removing all those appointments that were made by the last government, because several of them were old guard bankers, to put it at its nicest, people who shouldn't have been there, people who were involved in the property market, and some of them are political hacks as well.
I want to come back to you on what has changed, what needs to change. I want to bring Eugene McElrain in at this point from our Belfast studio. Eugene, I know you haven't had time to read the report in its entirety, but on the basis of what you've seen, what do you make of this report? How revealing is it?
Well, I think unfortunately it's less than it should have been, less satisfactory, because if you compare it to other reports in the banking industry, like the United States and indeed our previous DIRT report, there's an insufficient detail in this report to actually tell us what actually happened, why it happened. It really tells us what we already knew and doesn't give us sufficient detail.
What is it you need to know, though? What's not in it that you want to know?
Well, for instance, this should not have happened. There's meant to be a triple lock system in place in the risk management and audit functions to make sure that this type of lending should not have happened. And the report does not explain why that triple lock system did not work. I was anticipating that we would get some detail in that, and yet the detail is sadly absent.
Why do you think it didn't work? I mean, there were checks and balances there. We had a financial regulator. We did have people within the central bank who were perfectly well qualified to know what was going wrong. Had they read the figures? Had they passed on the figures? Why didn't it happen, do you think?
Well, that's the inexplicable question. What's clear is that this isn't any particularly difficult banking problem. This is very basic banking. And yet, despite that, no one actually was able to say that too much concentration of all this lending in one area is very, very dangerous. And that wasn't stopped, even though the financial regulator was made fully aware of it.
What about the responsibility? I know you worked for a long time as an internal auditor with AIB. What about the responsibility of the bankers themselves? There, surely, is the first fault. That's where the first line of defence is supposed to obtain.
That's absolutely right, Richard, all the way from the directors on the board and the executives who were in charge of lending, through to the credit review functions, the people who were charged with reviewing the credit, the risk management function, who meet on a monthly basis to review credit concentration, sectoral analysis. All those things are done on a monthly basis. So how they failed to identify and report this problem and have all the limit breaches that are mentioned dealt with is not explained, and I find it difficult to understand how it was allowed to happen. Well, and the point about this is not to go over old history. I'm only interested in history insofar as it affects the future. So for the future, we need to know the answers to these questions to make sure it can't happen again.
Elaine Byrne, the same question has to be asked of everybody involved in this. How could they not have known? Or if they did know, why didn't they do more to stop it? It seems as if everybody had a rush of blood to the head.
Absolutely, and it's what in the report is referred to as the herd mentality. But I think the thing about the report is that it blames everybody, and by blaming everybody, then nobody is responsible and then nobody is held accountable. And I think what the Irish people really need to hear at this stage is, who are probably in report fatigue mode, is that this was wrong and that people need to be named and that this does not need to happen again. And I thought that it was a little bit disappointing, because on the election night, in his first contribution in his interview after being elected with such a fantastic majority, Enda Kenny told Brian Dobson that he was going to extend the terms of reference of this banking inquiry to include political decision making. And I think it's a bit of a misnomer to describe this just as a banking inquiry, because that then assumes that the only decisions under inquiry are those with the financial regulator or the central bank. And there's a whole host of decisions which were not allowed to be under scrutiny in this inquiry. Things like, just very briefly, the 2000-2007 special incentive tax scheme, which cost the Exchequer 800 million, the 2004-2007 capital relief scheme for new hotel developments, which cost the Exchequer 329 million. In your own programme 2 years ago, you had a special investigation into the lending practices of banks, and in regard to the Minister for Finance between 1997 and 2004, Charles McCreevy, and how he was fast-tracked a mortgage of 1.6 million. And then what about local planning decisions which allowed rezoning to occur? John O'Connor, over a number of years, as the chair of On Board Panola, pointed out the erroneous decision making there, the structure of local government funding and why local government was dependent on development levies, and it just goes on and on and on. And this is going to happen again and again unless we're going to stand up and say this was wrong. This is the elephant in the room here is not just the bankers and the regulators, it's also how the structure of our politics is set up. And between 1998 and 2000, banks like Anglo-Irish Bank, Irish Life donated almost £70,000 to Fianna Fáil, and in the 3 elections between 1997, 2002 and 2007,
Are you saying the Fianna Fáil turned a